Blues or a quarterback for the Oxford Commas. Robert has also recently done something quite remarkable. He published his debut novel, Mort, with Soho Press. They have generously donated a couple of copies, so I hope everyone got their name in the raffle. Robert's writing has also appeared in publications like The Literary Review, Night Train, Hobart, and the Coachella Review. He'll also be publishing a novella with Amazon Kindle singles this spring. Robert hails from Drexel Hill, Pennsylvania. He holds an MFA in creative writing from Emerson College, and he teaches at the Gotham Writers Workshop. He was also in the Peace Corps, and he once defended himself from an attacker wielding a meat cleaver.
Wow. Not very successful.
I don't think this is actually working, so whatever. It looks cool. Thank you for coming out. I appreciate it. I realize that it's a weird time of day to do this. I'm very grateful. Thank you to the social committee for setting it up. I appreciate it a lot, and thank you for the lovely introduction, for throwing in the meat cleaver line. I think that's the first story I told some people who just started working here, so that's probably not the best first impression. But anyway, okay, so I'm going to try to explain to you what my book is about, and feel free to giggle a little bit because it is a bit madcap, but basically I wrote this novel. It's about a war between humans and animals. And the war is instigated by this queen of a colony of intelligent ants. The ants are convinced that humans need to be wiped out and they need to start over. And their master plan involves injecting this hormone into the water supply that will cause all the service animals to become intelligent. So they can walk, they can walk on 2 feet, they can grow hands, they can talk, they start their own little society, and they join this war effort against the humans to try to wipe them all out. So it's a comedy in a lot of ways, but the main part of the story involves a cat who has been transformed. The cat calls himself Mort. All the animals adopt a new name when they become intelligent. And he lives through the war. A good friend of his is presumed dead. And then in the aftermath, he gets this mysterious message, presumably from the last humans on Earth, that she's still alive. And then he goes on this journey to go find her. And then he discovers what the war was all about, and there are many zany adventures. There's a dirigible, there's a big battle on an island, there's all sorts of crazy stuff that happens. So I'm going to read a section here that is from the perspective of the ant queen. Her name, she goes by the name of Hymenoptera unis. And the thing that's important to know about her is that she lives in this underground, it's basically a bunker for her, where she's laying eggs all day. And the way the ants' language works is the ants communicate through chemicals, and all this information goes into the queen's brain, and she basically stores all of the experiences of every single ant who's ever lived. So that's sort of driving her cuckoo, and it's one of the reasons why she lashes out in unhealthy ways. I guess the other thing to mention here is that this is probably the closest I will ever come to writing a sex scene in a book. And you might need a cigarette when we're done, I don't know. So here goes. This is about 7 minutes, so hopefully I won't be talking too long. And then we'll take some questions about the horrors of publishing a novel. Okay, so yes, we're in the ant lair. The queen is hanging out. Her chambermaids are bringing her information. We're here now. Okay. The queen saw everything. The world, once so terrifying to her people, had been reduced to a viscous liquid poured into her, where it would be studied, manipulated, and conquered. There was no fear of the dark. The queen was the darkness now, pulling in all beams of light like a black hole. She could not turn back or make peace, for this burden forced her to keep going until everyone was dead, until the only life left was the hint of her chemical trail drifting in a dry wind. The queen always brooded over the future on mating day, the annual event when the fertile males and females would be launched from the island, joining their bodies in midair and returning to the ground to establish new outposts of the colony. Because she never slept, the queen could not visit the future through dreams. Piecing together the days to come was the only escape from the constant flow of information. The future had a perfection that the past would always lack. The time to come was a perfectly crystallized snowflake, a chemical trail leading to a hazy but brightening sunrise. Mating days were always frantic, the air charged with multiple signals, shouting help, or here, or go, relayed to the queen's lair so that she could observe. Thus the queen relived the experiences of every eager yet frightened participant. From millions of vantage points at once, she could see the rocky landscape flutter with a galaxy of silvery wings. It was the way of her people to gather in a frenzy and risk exposure to the outside world in order to renew their species. In the wild, during the age of the humans, the ritual had an element of desperation. Every mating day could be the colony's last. Predators of all kinds were driven to the mounds, attracted to the scent or the sound of wings, or perhaps even a change in temperature as the ventilation shafts released hot puffs of air in the days leading up to the ceremony. Mammals, reptiles, and birds would paw at the earth. The workers, obeying orders, would keep hauling the fertile ones out to their doom until the soldiers intervened, grinding their teeth into the intruder's flesh, or firing acid into the predator's eyes and nostrils. Human interference added a new, unpredictable element. Sometimes they were simply curious and would carelessly scrape away the top layer of dirt to expose the writhing ants. Thousands of children over the years had been driven away squealing after plunging their hands into the soldiers' quarters. Other humans would attempt to destroy the nest, usually for what seemed to be mere pleasure. Several mating days had to be aborted during a human attack, the fertile ones going senile and dying in their chambers before having a chance to fulfill their purpose. Still other humans would camp out the day of the mating. They would pluck the fat females from the horde, tear the wings off, and drop them into buckets to be cooked and eaten later. Sometimes the males would desperately hurl themselves toward the buckets and mate with the wingless would-be queens as they bled to death among their sisters. The queen relived all the previous mating days, the successes and the setbacks, as she collected information on how the latest event was proceeding. The males were marched out first, wet and shivering, but warming in the sun. The workers prodded them toward an opening near the western side of the island, where they would be shielded from the brunt of the sunlight. They still had to gain their footing, though their main skill was to fly. The clumsy ones who tumbled over were gently righted again, if for no other reason than to get them to stop sending anxious signals as if the entire colony were under attack. It was an amusing contrast to the mammals, who were in the bad habit of putting their males in charge. And then the winged females emerged, sleek and menacing angels, more beautiful than any other creature on Earth, the future of all life. The females marched out of their chamber, thronged by soldiers and workers who would give their lives to protect them as if they were queens already. The males waited, their wings shaking off the last drops of moisture. Many would die, almost all in fact. They were so tiny, and even though their arch enemies had been driven toward extinction, so many things could get them killed before, during, and soon after a mating. Errant winds, a poorly timed landing, getting their wings wet and collapsing from exhaustion while they tried to flap them dry again. They would be cut off from the colony unless they succeeded in establishing new outposts, and even then it would be their responsibility to reconnect with the island. Because she became queen and then mated under emergency circumstances, Hymenoptera was fortunate to have avoided the massacre, for even her intellect would not have saved her from the random cruelty of the world. For now there was hope. Until the fertiles took flight, every male was a father to a successful line, and every female was a queen who would spread the range of the colony to new lands. Their people would build, farm, hunt, and protect. They would move tons of earth, construct massive cities, and produce an endless supply of crops, bending nature to their collective will. This mating day would help to redeem all life in the wake of the human scourge. A signal started as a whisper and soon turned into a siren. The workers released their grip on the females. The shiny black angels took flight. The queen, though buried in her lair, flew with them. The island dropped from beneath her. All around her, wings flapped, pushing the clean air onto her face, brushing it through her antenna. The sun passed through the clouds to ignite the horizon. The convoy moved away from the light and toward land in the west. Then the males ascended to join them. Rather than launching, they wobbled as they rose, like bubbles climbing to the surface of a pond. They were more delicate, and a slight breeze would tip them sideways. They bumped into one another and yet kept rising, an airborne colony unto themselves. The queen flew among them as the safe ground lowered out of sight. And then it happened, the music of their species. The two masses intertwined in midair. Claws dug into carapaces. Strong females shrugged off the unworthy, sending them tumbling. The most determined, desperate males alighted on the lead females. Some were so aggressive they bit into the females' necks to keep them still. And then they united, their bodies coiled against one another. Every successful union resulted in both partners remaining still, not flapping their wings. They plummeted. There was a terrible yet beautiful moment when almost all of them stopped flying at once and dropped to the water. Blissful spirits no longer afraid of death, falling, the shimmering sea welcoming them. Until at last the act was done, and the females spread their wings again, knocking away the hapless, exhausted males. Some of the drones were so spent that they continued to dive until they splashed down in the salt water, belly up, legs shaking. The females glided west to land, toward the future. The chemical trail faded away for the queen. Her antenna begged for more. Her maids had nothing left to offer. It always ended like this, with the most ecstatic moment of disintegrating too soon. Even if these new queens died, every last one of them, they were still the lucky ones. They could escape this place and choose their own destinies. They could unite with another in a moment of madness. They would never feel the responsibility of Hymenoptera. The frantic noise, the thick scents, all ceased, replaced with the familiar smell of the chamber, the sound of the workers moving about, cleaning her, plucking eggs from her abdomen. Life continued. That's it. I said plops, okay? You can edit that out, right? Okay, good, all right. Okay. I don't know, so I took a long time to write this. I actually started this in 2009 and spent several years trying to find an agent, and then another year or so trying to publish it. And then it's been a while since we actually made the book deal, so I don't know if there are any questions I could answer, or yes?
So is this like an allegory or something?
It's less allegorical than Animal Farm. I mean, obviously, when I was trying to convince people to represent it and then publish it, I was definitely playing up the Animal Farm. And the scene we read here isn't as Animal Farmy as the rest of the book. It's not. It is less of an allegory and more of a, you know, what's not an allegory?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's like, is there like in your mind that it represent one thing, your cat's another thing, you know? Like,
no, I guess not. No, I mean, it definitely, the book is commenting a lot on human rights and animal rights. It's commenting a lot on like the power of religious belief. It's commenting a lot on like political structures. I wouldn't say that the ants necessarily represent a particular group. They might represent a particular tendency, which would be seeing themselves as like the height of all reason, and therefore anybody who stands in the way is almost diseased to the point where they need to be quarantined. They actually use that terminology. Mm-hmm. I'm not comparing them to any particular group. There would be a very extreme group if such people existed. But yeah, it is allegorical, but it's not an allegory. If that's the weirdest way to answer the question. But okay. Anybody? Yes?
How did you balance writing a book with your job?
Not very well. Let me emphasize, in case is Damon here, I have never written at work, I promise, okay? Good, I wouldn't be able to anyway, because it just, it wouldn't work. I usually write from 10 p.m. till midnight, most nights. Now, writing doesn't necessarily mean producing a certain number of words. Sometimes it might just be research, or it might be tweaking something I've already written, or something like that. But usually, 2 hours a night, you do that for 18 months. I think you can produce a novel. You just have to accept that, some nights you're only going to produce 200 words, and you just have to move forward, just be happy with that and do it again the next night. I'm kind of a night owl, so even if I didn't work a full-time job, I still wouldn't start writing until 10 p.m. So even if I quit this job, it wouldn't like improve my output. I still would, just be doing a few hundred words a day. So, but yeah, I usually did it at night, and and once in a while you dedicate a weekend to it. And Monday morning you're like, oh my God, I haven't shaved in 3 days. But I don't do that too often. It's not very healthy. Anybody else? Again, next. All right, then you two.
You go first. I already done. Or he, whoever.
Use a he. All right, we'll come back. We'll come back. All right.
I was going to ask what it's like, or what it was like being on the other end of the author-editor spectrum.
It was, well, okay, so the first phase of it, which lasted way too long, which was me trying to send it out to people, was incredibly frustrating. Because, you know, several agents actually said to me, like, wow, this is a really quirky idea for a book. It's too bad you haven't already written 5 books, because a debut author trying to publish this is not gonna work. Like, I can't sell that. This is too. So that phase of like trying to find the agent and all that was very frustrating. Now, once we found the agent that was right for the book, you know, then I had like this champion who was doing all that work and communicating for me, which was great. And you know, and then once we paired up with Soho Press, you know, it's a smaller publishing house, so we've gotten a little more attention that maybe someone working with a bit bigger publishing house would get. So overall, it's been positive. The revision process that came with that was very, very difficult, but not like difficult in the sense that there was a lot of work to do, not difficult in the sense that they were asking too much of me. Even after they bought the book, they wanted me to remove another 100 pages from the manuscript. And I did that during that polar vortex winter. So I was like the only person who was like happy about the polar vortex. But yeah, like around, I like telling this story. So it was Thanksgiving of 2013. My editor said, let's get a beer. And he said, and he's a novelist too, I should mention that. Mark Doughton is his name. He just published a novel called The Infernal. And so he has a lot of experience with this too, but he said, we're gonna take out 100 pages and I need it by January 15th. This was Thanksgiving of 2013. So over the next few weeks, yeah, I took out, the book went from 476 pages and 134,000 words to 380 or 376 and 97,000 words. So a massive cut. So there was still a lot of work to be done, but we got the attention that the book needed. And you know, the book has a lot of POV characters. It is quite long, so it needed the professional help. And so we got it. So overall, that phase of the author experience was positive. So, all right, yes.
What do you do with all the content you have?
It is lost to the ages. A lot of it was junk. I mean, a lot of it was, you know, I have a bad habit of trying to give everything and everyone a backstory, and it was bogging down the whole story. It's mostly junk. It doesn't need to be saved. Nothing. There was nothing in it that really added much to the story. It was just a lot of stuff that points that I already made, and you know, it's just really, I mean, that revision process, I learned so much about what I often do wrong in my writing, which is just add too much material. So yeah, I don't need to go back to any of that stuff. It's gone. Let it go. Yeah. Yeah.
I was struck in this book by the way you kind of juggle some big ideas and some very serious situations with some frankly hilarious prose. And I was just, I wonder if you could talk a bit about how you achieved that tone, because I think that is important.
Yeah, I definitely maintained there are a couple moments in the book where I sort of wink at the reader, but for the most part, the book is told in like sort of a deadly serious way. But even at those moments, it becomes so serious that becomes a sort of joke for the reader. You know, things like, you know, the chapter where the queen is basically wiping out humanity obviously has a lot of like dark humor in it that needed it, and I still wanted people to really see the seriousness of humans being wiped out. So I had to maintain this like deadly serious tone throughout all of it, but it ends up being keeping it. The problem is that if it had gone into the silly realm or too far into satire, I think the whole thing falls apart. It just doesn't. I'm not necessarily going for plausibility, because the story that I'm telling here is completely implausible. And some of the people who read this book, maybe who were expecting science fiction, would probably notice that. Like, well, this would never happen. I know that. Can't point that out. It's sort of like the flux capacitor. How does Marty McFly go back in time? Flux capacitor. How does it work? Very well, thank you. So I had to like, set that aside and sort of maintain that like deadly serious tone, and I think that allowed me to not edit, like sort of stopped me from editorializing, because there are a lot of moments in the book where it would be ripe for editorializing about like human rights or animal rights or the environment or religion or something. That wouldn't work if the narrator started doing that. And it wouldn't work if the characters started doing it too much either. The characters did it in the earlier drafts, and the editors were like, "No, stop! Why? We don't need a speech from the dog about why, we need to consider eating less meat. We don't need that." Okay, so, all right. Anybody else? Yes.
So what genre would you call this? Is it science fiction?
It's leaning towards science fiction. The problem is these terms are so loaded. I mean, calling it science fiction suggests spaceships and like something that's actually plausible. Calling it fantasy, that has, it is really fantasy, but the problem is when you say fantasy in the publishing world, that often means like Game of Thrones. With all due respect to that, but that's not what this is either. I still refer to it as a science fiction novel or as a fantasy novel, but both of those terms are very problematic, and I don't know where it goes. So.
How did Soho categorize it?
It depended on who they were talking to. Because when we reached out to like IO9, which is a science fiction blog, we definitely positioned it as a science fiction book. But Soho is mainly known for literary works. So they also tried to reach out to, like the Rumpus and other like electric literature and other venues for that. So they could consider it as more of a literary novel, whatever that means. I mean, that's a loaded term as well. What the hell does that mean? Yeah, it just depended on who we were talking to. If you were a nerd, I would say it's science fiction. And if you were like somebody from my MFA program, be like, well, I wrote this. I would suggest the outward thing, Meg. So, all right. Anybody? Meg, did you have another question?
I did, yes. Well, actually,
You did, that's right, yeah.
Thank you for remembering.
I remember.
Actually, it's kind of already answered, but I was wondering if there was like a more like Silmarillion, like somewhere like you have like this backlog of like all the like backstories and stuff for all the characters, and you created this huge, pile of data, and then you took the story out of that, or if it's just,
No, that would be an interesting way of writing it, and I did think of something like that. The way this book is structured is that the first few chapters take place during the war with the humans, and then the rest of the book takes place like 8 years later. And so in the earlier versions of the book, that section of the war was only like 2 chapters. It eventually grew to 4. And so that was sort of, in a way, what you're talking about, where I had to build that foundation of like mythology in order for the rest of the book to actually work. Because people reading the rest of the book and saying, well, what's happening? I'm like, well, he suppressed the memories of the war. They're like, no, that doesn't work. We need to actually see him like joining the military. We need to see him killing some humans and so forth. So we sort of like added to the mythology of it, and like the, you know what? It's okay. And I talk with my hands. And like there's one character in particular who's a bobcat who's like this sort of like Rambo character, and he could have his own little story because he has this whole backstory, like mythology behind him about how he joined and his relationship with the humans and so forth. So in some ways, yes, there was, but it really, it sort of grew organically from it. It wasn't the starting point. So, yes?
What's the novella about?
The novella is a science fiction novel for real this time. And it's about a guy working for a multinational corporation that is overseeing the reconstruction of a bombed out Philadelphia. And he's been sent on a weird errand for them, and in the process of that he discovers some people who are living in the, sort of like an Occupy Wall Street group of people who are living in the city and protesting what the corporation is doing. And he has to sort of, his loyalties are tested. So it's only like 70 pages, comes out in the spring, and yeah, that's our next project. So. Yes?
Are you happy with the final product, or are you still struggling with like, if I only change this, or do you?
I am overall happy with it, and like I said, we had a lot of, there's this fantasy of like writing as this, moment of you get struck by lightning and you do it, but really it's a collaborative process. My agent made me revise it twice before she agreed to represent me. The publisher insisted that I remove a huge chunk of it, as I just said. So there was a ton of work to be done on it. I was really happy with how it turned out. I'm right now listening to the audiobook and hearing how it plays out when it's interpreted, and that's been interesting because one of the things there's a lot of dialogue in it. So one of the things I do is add a lot of those tags, like he said and she said, but hearing that on an audiobook, I'm like, maybe I could have done with less of those, because it's actually interrupting the interesting interpretation of the voices. But no, overall, I'm happy with how it turned out. I mean, you never really finish with one of these things. This is just as far as we got. And I'm certainly happy with the cover, which is, we get a lot of, and I like it when people ask if I designed the cover, and then I'm tempted to be like, oh yeah, that was definitely me. So yes, I'm happy. Yes?
Do you hope for your book to be a form of activism to push people towards thinking one way or another about animal rights or environment?
Maybe activism goes too far, but definitely it's philosophical in the sense that it's asking the question of should humans be placing themselves at the center of the universe? Are some of our philosophies, our preconceived notions about religion and the afterlife in particular, are they doing more harm than good? I mean, those are questions that the book is asking. Also, if animals were intelligent the way we are, we would have to reconsider our place in the universe and how we treat them. I mean, clearly we haven't been very nice to them. But it asks us questions about ourselves. That forces us to ask questions about ourselves, I hope. So yeah, not so much activism, but definitely philosophical. And I think it would be easy to draw some conclusions from this. I mean, especially with some of the political and religious things. I think some people could read the book as saying that religion is this terrible thing, and other people could read the book as saying that losing your religion is a terrible thing. Both of those questions are explored. Hopefully people walk away from it saying that the question is still up in the air, rather than just saying the book clearly says this. I don't think that would be very fair. So. Yes?
In terms of planning ahead versus just plowing ahead and watching your characters do whatever they want to do, where do you fall on that spectrum?
More toward planning. I at least do a chapter outline, an outline of the chapters, I should say. So, I mean, and basically the chapter isn't necessarily saying what's going to happen. The chapter, when I write the notes out, it's here's what I need to do here. Here's what we need to accomplish in order for the next thing to actually work. And the story is pretty much told chronologically. That's how I write most stories. So, you're sort of locked into that. If you don't write one thing, then the next thing's not going to make any sense. So yeah, I definitely lean more toward planning. I'm working on a project now, which is probably the most planned out I've ever had something, and that feels weird because. But you plan a lot, but you still have to be prepared to revise. I mean, I spent a year and a half writing this, but something like 4 revising it, and that's the thing that I think has been the hardest to embrace, because I still believe in this romantic idea of Jack Kerouac tying a big roll of paper to the back of a typewriter and typing for 3 weeks, and that's how he got on the road. And it's not really how it works. And I wouldn't want to do things his way. He didn't last very long, so I want to be a healthy person. So, yeah. All right. Yes?
So is this like a post-humanist novel or story in some sense in the title, in the titles of the title? When you're saying, you're emphasizing kind of not animal rights, but kind of animal rights, philosophical questions about human role in that, and just kind of the gestures that you were making earlier about that sounded in that realm.
Yeah, it would be weird. It would definitely be weird to call this book humanist, because the humans are evil, are the bad guys in it. But post-humanist, I think, suggests that humans aren't around anymore. Is that a good way of looking at it?
In general, it just means reconceiving ethics and relations in terms of humans not being the center, which is what you're saying before. So okay, how does animal and the ecology in general, how could they be the center of various political and ethical systems?
Yeah, I think it is definitely raising that. It just doesn't come to any particular conclusion because, you know, one of the things, you know, eventually, not to give too much away, but the humans do make an appearance in the book. And their role in the story and what they believe in and how they organize themselves and how they can help Mort achieve his goal, you know, that's sort of up for debate how they're doing all those things. Like whether they're doing the right thing, whether they've been deluded, whether they really have much of a future anymore. So, yeah, I'm sort of like dipping my toe in that to answer your question. So, yeah. Yes?
What were your inspirations for this film?
Well, I think I grew up watching a lot of like really bad 80s science fiction movies, and I feel like there's a lot of stuff in here that sort of harks to that. You know, like just the sort of zaniness of it, of having these giant animals running around. You know, I was a big fan of the movie Them, which came out in the 50s actually, but it's still that kind of like almost outlandish, hyperbolic situation. I read, wouldn't surprise you probably, I read a lot of Kurt Vonnegut and his sort of brand of science fiction, which is sort of like telling these outrageous stories as deadpan voice. I think inspired a lot. Also, just the basic beginning of the story, it came from a dream I had. And the dream had an alien spaceship flying around, and the aliens turned the animals into these killing machines. And I was very upset by it. Because it took place at my parents' house where I grew up. So it was just like upsetting that these like animals were like showing up and like burning my parents' house down. And yeah, I'm not in therapy. But then it took me a while to think of like who the villains of the story should be. Aliens didn't really work, so I changed it to ants because they actually had a reason to be angry with humans. So that once I had that in place, that helped me to build the story because I didn't want the villains just to be evil. You know, that's boring. So hopefully the ants have some motivation, even though they're the antagonists and, you know, don't get as much time on the page as Mort and his buddies. Yes.
What sort of research did you do into the mating rituals of ants?
All right. Okay. So.
You reference resources you.
You know, a lot of the research I did on ants, you know, I watched a lot of documentaries and tried to read some books and some reference works, yes. But, you know, I realized a lot of stuff I wanted to do with the ants doesn't really work in the real world. A lot of what you see with the ants in my book is sort of an amalgamation of what many different species of ants do. Probably the most egregious thing, though, is that I make the queen into like this omniscient ruler, whereas really in an ant colony, the queen is just another worker, just a specialized worker, but a worker nonetheless. She's not issuing orders, and she's certainly not bringing knowledge into her brain and like processing it. It's not really what they do. So I did it, the thing that I like to tell people is that I did enough research to come to the conclusion that I had to completely come up with new things. This wouldn't work. The other research I had to do, I did some research on dog fighting. There's a character in the book that's a pit fighter. I guess I did some other research on like some farm animals and stuff, but I tried not to go into too much detail in this book. Like I said, there's a lot of flux capacitor moments in this book where just, look, this is how it works and move on. So I didn't want to spend too much time bogged down with different things. I just want, you know, there's a lot of ground to cover and a lot of characters. But yeah, it's not that kind of book. Anybody else? Shoot. Okay, yes.
Does Mort differ greatly from your previous work? As far as like style goes, like those are about animals?
It differs from the previous work in that I had tried to write a couple of like autobiographical novels, the kind of novels that a lot of MFA programs kind of encourage. I went to an MFA and really, you know, I'm glad I spent my time doing that, but they weren't very good. And they deserve to like be shelved and never thought of ever again. So it wasn't until a few years ago I started moving into more science fiction. I had written one that took place in the Caribbean, which is where I lived for a couple of years. And that one is still sort of up in the air. I'm still working on it. But this one was probably the most outlandish science fiction one. So it's slowly moving from more realistic fiction into pretty outlandish science fiction. This sort of like, by then I had already spent a while writing novels and sort of failing to get things published, getting rejected, and I was like, well, let's just write something that I think is fun. And that's really, in a lot of ways, drove this book. Even when I was like, oh, this really isn't going to work, but that kept things going, I think. Should we move on to the raffle? I don't know how much time I've taken. Okay.
Did everybody get a chance to fill out your name for the raffle? You haven't?
All right, while she's doing that, did anybody else have a question? Yes?
At what point did you decide to get an agent or do something?
What point did I decide to get an agent? So I had tried to get an agent with the autobiographical novel that I wrote as part of my MFA thesis, but I couldn't find one. No one wanted it. So yeah, that's how it works when I say I couldn't find one. And then I had an agent for the Caribbean book I just mentioned, but that wasn't really going anywhere, so I had to part ways there. I decided on an agent just because I wasn't comfortable with doing the self-publishing for this particular project. I think that works for a lot of genres, but for this one, I thought I needed that representation, especially for this. I mean, I couldn't approach a publisher and be like, "Here's my talking cat book." I needed some credibility to sell that. Otherwise, yeah, it just wouldn't have worked. It wouldn't have worked. So for this one, it was really like all or nothing. Yeah, and what happens now with agents is that they do a lot of the editing work, and the book needed that as well. Besides the representation and that legitimacy, whatever that is, it needed that professional help. Otherwise it would just been a huge sprawling mess. And a lot of the plot points in here were directly from my agent's recommendations. So I have to give her a lot of credit for how it ended up working out. Okay, there are more questions, but okay, all right. Well, these are the last two right here.
Did you ever get tired of writing it, like in the 18 months or however long it took for the first draft? And did you work on other projects at the same time, or?
I did stop it for a little while to work on this novella that had come up earlier. I didn't really get tired of it. I definitely there's sort of like big moments in the book, and then when you write that, and then you have to go into that's sort of like a more character building exposition part. It's like, so that definitely got me bogged down a little bit. But once I got over sort of the second act of the book and entered the third act, that third act went along really fast. I actually was so into it, I left a New Year's Eve party and went home and worked on it. So that last act was really fun, but that middle act was like, let me just say, the middle act is now really exciting though. I promise. Don't give up on the book. Okay. All right, and then I saw one with Zach was in the back, and we'll go there.
When you negotiated your contract, were you able to retain the film rights?
I think, okay, listen, I will be happy to maintain this pipe dream about the book turning into a movie. I think it's very unlikely. I just need to point that out because it would need to get way more attention than it's gotten. And the attention's gotten, I'm happy with it, but like it would have to get way more attention, and it would have to find someone who would be willing to spend like $150 million to make a movie like this. So it's a long shot. But to answer your question, I think I have the rights to it. I think because my agents talked to me about it. I mean, like she said, like show people, but I believe we have the rights to it. Maybe I got to look at. Thank you. I'm glad you're here. I need to actually read these contracts before I sign them. That might.
I'll say we a lot. We were looking for an agent. Is there another partner that you work with or a manager or something?
I have people from my MFA program that I show my work to, but they're not in an official capacity. At this point, most of the stuff that I'm writing goes through my agent, and that's like I said earlier, that a lot of that editorial work has sort of bled out of the publishing companies and is now done a lot by the agents. I mean, the agents are basically freelance editors now, and that's that's why it's so hard to get something published, is that like you have to, I think what I've heard is that years ago you could just send like a great idea with a messy manuscript to a really ambitious editor, and they would be like, I'm going to make this better, but like, I think those days are over. If they were ever happened at all, I don't know if they did. That's what I hear from people. But. Okay. You want to? Yes, I think that's good. All right. You want to do our raffle?
Yeah.
All right. So gorgeous.
We're substituting.
And the back has the cat with a rifle and a big ant. So there you go. You don't need to read the story. That pretty much. All right. All right. Hopefully this is someone I like. I'm kidding. That's a joke. And it is Lauren Konopko. All right. Thank you. I will get it. If you want, I can sign that. Yeah. Okay. Next one. Callum Watts. All right. I don't know you. Thank you. I hope you like it. All right. Okay. All right. Awesome. Enjoy. All right. And is that it?
Yeah.
Thanks for
All right. Thank you.